and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Geun-hye. Coming up on today's program, South Korea's President Park Geun-hye is defending her decision to sign a controversial intelligence agreement with Japan. Will sharing military secrets with Tokyo make Seoul safer? And Chinese President Xi Jinping discussed the win-win cooperation with U.S. President-elect Donald Trump earlier this week. Strong U.S.-China ties have benefited both nations for decades, but the surprise election result has many experts wondering, what now? We start today's show in Seoul, where President Park Geun-hye is defending her decision to sign a very controversial military intelligence agreement with Japan. Park has ignored a strong opposition to the deal, calling the pact necessary for defense. Our panel will discuss potential repercussions to the deal, but first, this background story.
Sharing secrets. The General Security of Military Information Agreement, or GSOMIA, will give Japan access to South Korean military intelligence. Washington has strongly backed the controversial deal. Pentagon spokesman Gary Ross said that the pact could strengthen cooperation between the two countries, particularly in light of the growing threat posed by the DPRK. Former South Korean President Lee Myung-bak led efforts to sign a similar intelligence sharing pact with Japan 4 years ago, but those efforts failed at the last minute. The major reason? Strong opposition in South Korea based on memories of Japanese military aggression. Tokyo's refusal to face up to its colonial past and clumsy attempts to distort World War II history have hurt Japan's reputation abroad. Tokyo and Seoul reached an agreement to resolve the issue of comfort women last December, but many Koreans still can't forgive Japan for enslaving and raping tens of thousands of South Korean women during the war.
We strongly condemn Shinzo Abe's government. They're beautifying their invasion.
If Japan is really sincere about apologizing, then it must also take responsibility for what it did in the past.
The two countries also have a long-standing territorial dispute over a cluster of islands in the East Sea. But a perceived common threat, the DPRK has drawn the two nations closer together. Pyongyang conducted 2 underground nuclear tests and dozens of ballistic missile tests earlier this year. Park's government says the military intelligence sharing pact will help South Korea defend its borders, but opposition unpatriotic and humiliating deal. Opposition leaders have threatened to impeach the defense minister if the agreement is approved by parliament. It's questionable whether South Korea's unpopular president can implement the pact even if it is approved. The future of the controversial pact, just like the fate of President Park Geun-hye, remains to be seen.
For more in-depth discussion on the military intelligence pact between Japan and South Korea, we are joined here in Beijing by Mr. Zhao Tong, who is associate at the Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Beijing. In Washington, D.C., we have Ms. Bobina Huang, visiting professor at the Georgetown University and former senior special advisor to the United States State Department. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, we are having Mr. Sung-Yoon Lee, professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School at the Tufts University. Welcome. In Tokyo, Japan, we are joined by Professor Takasato Watanabe, who is a professor emeritus at Doshisha University. We have a very strong panel today, but certainly this is a very important issue to discuss. So may I open the discussion up by asking you, Professor Lee, what does South Korea try to achieve through this pact? What is this pact about?
Well, from a military standpoint, the growing North Korean threat, we know North Korea has accelerated its provocations, nuclear and missile tests this year in contravention of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. This is a strong incentive for South Korea to gain broader, greater access to intelligence, signal intelligence, which Japan is very good at, a high-tech nation as Japan is. So there is, I would say, compelling military national security incentive to share and to protect classified secret information between the two countries. However, of course, the crux of the problem is that South Koreans feel very much ambivalent about the Japanese government today and about Japan's historical aggression in Korea.
Right. Professor Watanabe from Japan, without commenting further, how would you understand Japan's initiative of trying to push so many times with this pact with South Korea?
Frankly speaking, the people in Japan or journalists in Japan, they don't think that this is so important for the people of Japan. However, the Japanese government, especially Abe administration, understand that this is good for the ties between the two governments of Japan and the United States to give some signals against China and North Korea. So this has two faces. For the Korean people themselves are against this because they criticize Japanese government not to remember or deflect the atrocities given to them during the war. So this is very complex.
Right. Professor Wang, at this moment, if we understand it right, this is the preliminary signing. This is not the final stage yet. The time of the final signing is not decided at this moment. How much opportunity does it really have, given the very chaotic situation in all capitals, it seems, at this moment?
Well, the GSOMIA has been the victim of political battles, domestic battles within South Korea for many years. It was supposed to be signed in 2012, but unfortunately was canceled at the time. And I think that despite all of the very important political dynamics that Professor Watanabe pointed to, and Dr. Lee, I think this actually has something even more basic. This is about information sharing. It is immediate, it is direct, and it is crucially important for the security of Northeast Asia for this agreement to be signed.
Mr. Zhao, here in Beijing, this pact is about two things: facilitate exchanges of information and also preventing so-called the crucial information falling into others' hands. Therefore, these two countries need to cooperate. From your perspective, how much chance this time it could have?
Well, in fact, preventing sensitive intelligence information from being obtained by thirds is a serious concern. In the case of this South Korea-Japan agreement, it's possible that the share of information is aimed at only about North Korea's nuclear and missile programs and should not be shared with any other third party. However, I think third parties like China will have legitimate concern because in practice, it's likely that intelligence information about China might be mistakenly shared. For instance, if Japan detects an unknown submarine in Yellow Sea and could not really identify which country it belongs to, should Japan share this information to South Korea or not? So I think,
or the other way around.
Yes. So I think China have legitimate interests and right to ask South Korea and Japan to take extra measures to make sure that they have institutionalized mechanisms built into this agreement to make sure any information regarding third party will not be shared.
Well, at this point, of course, Mr. Zhao, as we have the other three panelists clearly indicated, this is still the preliminary stage. It is not the final stage yet. Having said that, though, there seems to be another layer to this because we earlier have been talking about six-party talks, and China, Japan, South Korea, Russia are all inside this talk. And therefore, information sharing concern, even the nuclear issues, is a must to a certain extent among these countries if they really want to establish a mechanism. So to what extent it is between two countries, to what extent it should be by other parties is also an interesting question, isn't it?
Yes. In fact, South Korea and Japan already are sharing intelligence about North Korea with the United States. And South Korea also already signed a similar agreement with Russia. So there is already a coalition of countries sharing intelligence about North Korean nuclear missile programs among themselves. It's up to China to decide, what's the best way to take going forward,
Right.
whether China should, join maybe in the near future.
We're going to put China a little bit aside for this moment because we still have the capitals, whether it's Washington, D.C. or Seoul, struggling at this moment. One is with the new administration, the other, of course, with the chaotic situation with its internal politics. Professor Huang, we've been discussing many times about what's going on in Seoul in recent days. One thing is the opposition party is really against this. They even promised to dismiss or impeach the defense minister if this deal go ahead. Secondly, you have a lame duck president in the Blue House. So how much is this really likely to be a serious deal, or is one of those that's likely to dead once again?
Well, you asked earlier the question, is this really a good time? The point is, there's never a good time. As President Lee Myung-bak found out in the end of 2012 when he tried to sign this deal, and then it became hijacked by the Korean nationalism and emotionalism. There is never a good time, and in some ways this might actually be the best time, given that the opposition party has consistently been against President Park Geun-hye and always will be against the incumbent president. Now, it is a terrible time for President Park, but she has shown herself to be strong in foreign policy, particularly when it comes to the North Korean threat, and she has done this despite domestic political opposition. So I would actually argue that she might as well has tried, that she's not going to have any better chance, and the next president certainly won't. And it's a very important deal for the security of South Korea.
Okay, we certainly get your view, Professor Huang. What about you, Professor Lee? Is this really a must deal to be signed? How much benefits is really likely for Seoul, particularly given its political environment now?
Well, Seoul does need all the intelligence, all the information on North Korea's weapons development and maneuvering, defense posturing, and so forth, as much as possible. But with respect to the question of timing of this, I don't think this is a particularly good time because, as you said, President Park is up against the wall and the opposition party is enjoying great momentum. The balance of power has shifted in favor of the opposition party. To present you with a snapshot of South Korean public opinion, a couple of years ago, a major think tank in South Korea did a survey of favorability, asking respondents to rate President Obama, President Xi, President Putin, Prime Minister Abe, and the North Korean leader. Obama came in at the top with the highest point, and then it was President Xi, and then President Putin. And scraping the bottom of the barrel was Prime Minister Abe. That's the reality, and fanning the flames of anti-Japanese sentiment has been used by both parties throughout history, so that's the reality that the South Korean government has to face.
For Japan in Tokyo, Professor Watanabe, there are so many issues that is still unresolved. The territorial disputes between South Korea and Japan, wartime issues, comfort women, just to name a few. How optimistic is Tokyo about this? How much this is about security and safety for South Korea? How much of this, Professor Watanabe, is about Tokyo suggesting to itself that its military rise is accepted and also allowed by its neighbors in the region?
Frankly speaking, there are two opinions on this particular issue of the agreement. The first one is political level. They want to have strong ties with South Korea and also with the United States. However, the economic circles, they want to say like that on the surface, but they want to have some tension between the Korea, Japan, China, North Korea, and even Russia, because they want to get more money, more benefit through their own military industries. So this is true.
Yeah.
And second point is that the people of Japan, they don't pay attention much on this issue because they don't want to talk about the aggression of the Japanese militarism toward Korea and China and some Asian countries. And Mr. Abe is getting on this kind of the public opinion. However, the intellectuals and the media are criticizing the Mr. Abe. In addition, every information is, you see, owned by the U.S. military regime through satellites, through spy, activities. And this treaty is just, formal event. If they have this treaty, this is better for the politicians.
I see. Interesting point over there, Professor Watanabe. Coming back to you, Professor Lee, and another important point. President-elect Trump already talked with President Park on the phone, and he talked about, here I quote from the news story, 100% agree on the need to deter DPRK. Wow. Now, the deal with Japan by South Korea on intelligence sharing, a lot of it is about preemptive actions and intelligence sharing against DPRK. Now, the U.S. has already said very clearly with the new administration coming into the office, this is not going to be a problem. We are going to be with you. So, how much excuse, if we use the word, or how much ground does President Park still have about this deal? Professor Lee.
Well, President Park has an incentive to act presidential and to reach out to the president-elect in the United States. South Korea has just one treaty ally, and that is the United States. Mr. Trump has said during the campaign that he would pressure both Japan and South Korea to pay more to foot the costs of the presence of U.S. troops in both nations. And if they don't comply, then President Trump, if elected, will be willing to withdraw U.S. troops. The troops card has been used in the past. President Nixon, in the late 60s, in 1970, withdrew actually an entire division from South Korea, some 20,000 troops. And Jimmy Carter, a few years later, actually was quite serious on withdrawing U.S. troops entirely. But the reality was that the U.S. saw it to be the continued presence of the U.S. troops in South Korea to be in its national security interest, and I think that dynamic is still very much in place with the growing North Korean threat.
Professor Wang, your view?
Well, I think this discussion about troops is preliminary, and frankly, it's not really all that important. The important point is not about troop presence, but about capabilities. And the point is that this intelligence sharing agreement will increase the capabilities of South Korea and Japan to defend both themselves and the region. And I think that is really the crucial point.
Dr. Zhao, here in Beijing, at this moment, Chinese President Xi Jinping already talked on the phone with President-elect Mr. Trump. And President-elect Trump said he totally agreed with the point that President Xi made, which is about the win-win for the future. However, the two, of course, did not even got the chance to go into the details, whether it's TPP or whether it's the pivot to Asia or something like that. But having said that, though, this is a very different approach President-elect Trump already taken from his campaign rhetorics. Remember how many against China rhetorics he had in one debate? But how much would this be able to ease China's concerns? How much would this be able to let China, go free with some of the other neighbors, whatever they're doing, including even this intelligence sharing pact between South Korea and Japan?
Well, first of all, I think the current Trump rhetoric about improving U.S.-China relations more reflects his approach of being precautious, knowing that he knows very little about foreign policy, so just sticking to the talking points of the advisors. But in general, I think over time he will take more steps towards restraining from investing more resources into allies. That's consistent with his long-term ideological belief, his long-term policy tendency. Under that scenario, I think this agreement between South Korea and Japan also reflects deep suspicion of both Seoul and Tokyo towards President Trump, given that they suspect that they will receive less substantive military and security assistance from the United States, have to work more closely together among them too. I think that's one of the driving forces.
Right, but the question most importantly is, Professor Lee, whether the two could work together. I mean, they have so many controversies between them. This pact before it was being signed has become another layer of pressure for the government, at least in Seoul. So is this a good idea, or this is only diverting the two countries further apart, making all the sentiment and populism inside, at least in South Korea, ever rise?
It's a long-term challenge for both nations. It was mentioned by Professor Hwang that in 2012, South Korea tried to ram this pact through, and at the 11th hour, almost literally 50 minutes before it was supposed to be signed, the South Korean National Assembly, Congress objected, and they had to abandon the plan. Now is not a good time to ram it through. The problem here is the lack of transparency. The South Korean public is not keenly informed on the details of this pact. It is not a military alliance. It is not a treaty. It does not call for automatic intervention in the case the other party is threatened or attacked. It is simply a protocol for sharing and protecting sensitive information, not even top secret information. And both parties have the discretion of not sharing information that it deems too sensitive. So this is just a protocol, and it's the beginning. But right now, the opposition and the public have the opportunity and the strong incentive to be on the assault and to derail the process.
Professor Lee, if I could just push a little bit further. You said it is only an initiative to share certain kinds of information, not necessarily the most fundamental, but everything starts from a very beginning. Everything starts from something. So whether there is a past that's likely to be concerned about if we see this deal go ahead. And secondly, if this deal is not important, why do we need it? I mean, South Koreans might ask, Japanese might ask, the Chinese might ask, Russians might ask, if you don't have a very necessary means about it, why do you need it? You want it for makeup, or you want it for something else, for political purposes? Professor Lee, very briefly.
All of the above. As Professor Zhao mentioned, South Korea has a similar agreement with Russia already, with Canada. The U.S. has such an agreement with Brazil and many other countries. It's not that big a deal. But for South Korea, that faces a clear and imminent danger from its neighbor, North Korea. Taking advantage of Japanese capabilities, Japan has world-class technology when it comes to satellite monitoring, Aegis ships, expand radar, and so forth. South Korea has much to gain. However, the political hurdles are pretty strong, I would say, pretty high.
Professor Hwang, your thought here also briefly, if you can.
Yes, I think the important thing is that indeed South Korea has actually well over 30 of these agreements, and it is my understanding that South Korea has actually approached China several times, and actually very recently, about opening up GSOMIA talks with China. So, and I believe that there has been no response from China, so I'm not sure what the status is. But I think Professor Yoon is exactly correct. This is about broadening sharing of information, and even where I disagree with him is I agree that this is not a good time, but the point is it will never be a good time to sign this agreement with Japan within the context of South Korean domestic politics. There will never be a good time.
And Dr. Zhao, China's position, we do not know what Professor Huang earlier suggested, whether it's true or not, because we don't have any inside information at this moment. But having said that, though, where does that put China to?
Well, China has been hesitant about signing such agreement. The concern is this will be perceived as North Korea, as China allying with US and others against North Korea. However, personally, I think China could consider such possibilities in the future, because this sharing of intelligence is only about North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, which are prohibited by UN Security Council resolutions. So they broke international laws, and therefore China has legal support, has legal base to cooperate with others.
We see things are getting ever more complicated with all the uncertainties over the past few years. One layer after another, controversial issues. After that, there seems to be another agreement that's also in the horizon. We'll see how things would develop, but thank you so much for the four of you coming from different parts of the world joining us for this very important discussion. Zhao Tong, Bobina Huang, Song Yong Lee, Takasato Watanabe, really appreciate it. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Chinese President Xi Jinping discussed the win-win cooperation with U.S. President-elect Donald Trump on Monday. The U.S. has benefited greatly from trade with China, but Trump's controversial campaign rhetoric has many experts wondering, what now? Donald Trump doesn't move into the White House, not until next January, but people around the world, including U.S. think tanks, have been working very hard to analyze how he will shape the country over the next 4 years and also have an impact on the rest of the world. This week, in an interview series entitled What Now?, we look at Trump's stance on foreign policy and China-U.S. ties. Today, we speak with Dr. Geun-hye from the Brookings Institution about Trump's stance on China. But first, this background story.
A friendly conversation. Chinese President Xi Jinping called U.S. President-elect Donald Trump on Monday to congratulate him on his election victory. Xi reminded Trump that cooperation between the U.S. and China have brought tangible benefits to the people of both nations, and further cooperation was the only right path forward. She added that China attaches great importance to good relations with the U.S. Trump agreed that good U.S.-China relations were important for the world, and said he hopes for more mutual benefits and win-win results in the future. Trump also expressed willingness to strengthen bilateral ties. At the end of the call, the two leaders agreed to maintain close contact and establish a good working relationship. The friendly tone of the phone call has bolstered optimism that China and the U.S. can build stronger relations over the next 4 years. But many analysts warn against being too optimistic too soon. Trump's not yet established his administration, and his diplomatic policies are still unclear.
The most important is the top leaders. If the top leaders can create a kind of trust, or at least respect, can carry much weight in the bilateral relationship.
When will they meet again for the very first time?
Well, it's not.
APEC?
No, it's unclear at all.
Unclear at this moment.
But interesting to point out that the Chinese side over the past a few years really emphasized person-to-person relation. Start with Sunnyland,
yes,
and the Geun-hye and the G20 Hangzhou. You see that the very intimate environment, one-on-one. President Xi Jinping and President Obama. Now, it's still do not know whether they develop the friendship or not, but at least it's a very good relationship and mutually respectful. That's actually carry much weight to avoid things completely out of control. So the question is whether President Xi Jinping and the President elected Donald Trump can also form kind of a personal relationship, and that will be very interesting. And also, we should not forget, Nixon went to Beijing, and the most anti-communist person, went to Beijing, cut the deal. But of course, maybe it's that way. But again,
circumstances are very different, of course.
Absolutely,
One is about
absolutely,
Cold War, the other is
absolutely.
about strategic
but
trust.
at the same time, that I think Donald Trump faces a very difficult environment domestically, internationally. He always wants to get some scores. Now, during the campaign, certainly he bashed China, said something quite negative. But at the same time, he also seemed to give an indication that China has been doing right in terms of economic development, in terms of strategy, and etc. Now, whether this reflects his real thinking or just that he used it as politically to trash his rivals, we do not know. But anyway, he should be tested in the early on. We should give him benefit of the doubt, and using Hillary Clinton's words, we should be open-minded at this point.
It has always been the practice that when a new president comes into the office, there has been a learning curve, particularly U.S. president's learning curve about China. At the same time, we are seeing a coincidence because the coming year, also the Chinese Communist Party is also realigning its own leadership for the future. What would this coincidence possibly mean? That's still also a big question.
This is actually an excellent point, because for Chinese leaders, they want a stability, both at home and with the United States and in Asia Pacific crisis, before the 19th Party Congress. But for Donald Trump, he certainly, the change rather than continuity will be his main approach. And some of the changes could be good, but some of the changes could be very, very drastic and very, very destructive, and for the bilateral relationship. So that tension really should be our focus when we look at the bilateral relationship. And I think that early on it will be extremely important. They communicate to each other, and especially top leaders, and they try to find out to do not perceive each other, and hopefully can find some common ground that in certain issues, whether it be North Korea, whether it be global economic recovery, and etc. We do not know, but at the moment that it's interesting that both leaders are also constrained by domestic situation. But interesting to know that Xi Jinping actually talked about Chinese dream or China dream, but Donald Trump seemed like to end American dream. So that's a quite a contrast. So a lot of people to think maybe China is doing the right thing and American is going to wrong direction. Now, of course, it's still too early to say that, but again, I think these all tell us the leaders are important, and also the good policy, good judgment to be on the right side of history is so important in today's world. And also another difference is China, despite some problems and maybe they do not do appropriately, do not meet international norms, they embrace economic globalization. It's reflected in G20, but United States and some European countries more going to the inward looking, either isolationist or protectionism. So such a contrast is so interesting at this critical moment in world history.
Donald Trump's surprise election victory has created deep uncertainty about America's future role in world affairs. Trump has repeatedly spoken out against President Barack Obama's foreign policies, including his controversial and many say unsuccessful pivot to Asia. Obama's attempts to build strategic influence in Southeast Asia has been criticized by experts in a number of countries like the Philippines, Cambodia, Malaysia, and China. Analysts say aggressive U.S. military patrols have hurt stability in the region. Donald Trump has called for American allies in Asia and around the world to start paying for their own defense, and has emphasized that U.S. foreign policy should reflect the interests of average working-class Americans.
How much credibility the president-elect would have when during his campaign he mainly challenged the fundamental values of the American society for 200 years, and how much a change he could be once he comes into the office, turning totally against his earlier rhetoric. Is it possible?
Well, certainly he has the power base that those who will suffer and from this new policy, new approaches will also mobilize. This explains the demonstrations. And so again, this is a very divided, or ugly campaign, and American society, end up very much divided. You see huge divisions. And so therefore, I think that you will see a period, America enter a period with a lot of social tensions and social unrest, protests. I hope these protests will be peaceful, not violent, but that's the issue.
Uncertainty in the U.S., in the United States in itself, what would that mean for Mr. Trump and his team to establish a team dealing with its international policy, particularly policy concerning Asia-Pacific, China? Well,
there are two theories. One is because he is weak. He now wants to reach out to recruit some of the people maybe previously opposed him in the Republican Party, maybe even appoint a couple of Democrats to be his cabinet. And this is one theory. Secondly, he will go, with his own way. He ignored other people, and because he thinks that his approach is much better than others, and also he wants to use his power. He now is also control the Congress, and also he can appoint a Supreme Court judge. So that's actually make a lot of people very, very nervous. So with this kind of enormous power, he wants to do certain things right. Maybe uplift for public confidence. Some of the policies may be good, but some of the policies also will alienate a lot of people, got criticism both at home and abroad.
About specific issues, for example, North Korea, the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Given where South Korea is, its political crisis, and DPRK's rapid development of nuclear issue, and the six-party talks delay, no new solutions in the mind. Where are we going with President-elect being quite vague in foreign policy?
Well, I think that President Donald Trump will try to have some of the events or policy breakthrough to uplift the public confidence of him. I think North Korea highly likely will be his top priority. He may not think that way at the moment, but his advisor will probably tell him this is the things if you can really cut a deal and or particularly let China on board and more forcefully support U.S. that effort, you will gain tremendous support. Now, Chinese always consider him as a businessman, and despite the rhetoric anti-China, businessman for Donald Trump, everything is like a transaction of a deal. So if that's the case, of course, China also has a tremendous interest to not have North Korea to possess nuclear weapon. And previously, under the Obama administration, there's tremendous burden on China or pressure on China. On the one hand, they ask China to be forthcoming, to be cooperative. But at the same time, you consolidate your alliance with Japan, with South Korea, with Saturn missile system, so put Xi Jinping in a very awkward position. Now, if Donald Trump can say that, no, we are not a form alliance against you, but you should also help us to be, to deal with a serious problem. It's not only U.S. interest, but also China's interest. Now, if that deal can be made, this will be a very auspicious beginning, but we do not know. This is possible, and of course, it also depends on many other circumstances. So certainly, North Korea should be a top foreign policy challenge for him.
South China Sea, or shall we say, the peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region, to say that in a larger way. Some changes among the U.S. alliances in Southeast Asia. For example, the recent Filipino presidency's actions and words, and also Malaysian Prime Minister's visit to China, quite a long period of time, 8 days stay in China. How will these impact on the possibilities the president-elect and his team work on issues related to South China Sea and peace and stability from the U.S. perspective? Well,
here is the tensions between of the two perspectives. On the one hand, and Donald Trump repeatedly said that we should not take too much burden, and our policy should not be hijacked by third party. And particularly, it does not make sense that we help some of the countries, but these countries do not want to share the things. It was very critical. But on the other hand, Donald Trump was also has been surrounded by some of the advisors, very hawkish and very anti-China. So that's which way he will go. That will be very, very interesting to see that whether he will make some decision or really try to not use this kind of military force to deal with China, maybe try some other methods. But this all should be tested in the early period of his administration. But on the other hand, he sounds like he's preoccupied with so many issues.
Yes, indeed.
Certainly South China Sea will not be his on the top priority. You also is troubling that he seemed to move along well with his promise to improve the relationship with Russia, and that one can use Russia as possible kind of the car to deal with China. So we do not know. So again, we enter a period very uncertain, and also there are some factors, some evidence make people worry, make Chinese leaders, Chinese foreign policy analysts worry. But at the same time, that always come with challenge, but also with opportunity.
What do you make of the result, election result, and now all the things going on in the U.S., demonstrations, oppositions, different social debates, to say the least?
In my observation, he took kind of 5 parts of the strategy. I use the term 5 anti-corruption, anti-elite or anti-intellectual, anti-globalization, anti-immigration, and finally, anti-civil rights movement. The first 2, anti-corruption and anti-elitism, made by policies, but the other 3, globalization, anti-immigration, anti-civil rights, really challenge fundamental American values. America is a country of immigrants.
That is Dr. Geun-hye from the Brookings Institution from the U.S. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tianwei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.